Hello everybody, this is Fun Police, and I was planning on doing the third or fourth part, of the card reveals. However, there was a bit of a delay, and as such, we now have all of the cards shown off as the game was updated, and we can look at all of them. So rather than just trying to catch back up, I figured we can just go straight into giving the thoughts over all the cards. For today, I wanted to cover Germany, and then another video will cover each of the nations, as there's a lot of cards to go over, and I don't want this to be 3 hours long. So, but before that, I wanted to do something. We had the pre-order bundle, and I ordered one of those, and I have 3 officer packs. So I'm actually going to open one for the start of this video so we can see what we get. Alrighty, so one special and a bunch of standards. So this was kind of a lower impact officer pack, which is a bit of a shame. But those are some nice cards. First to Fight is one of my favorites, and Partisans is going to be very good also. So that's exciting. But yeah, definitely not the greatest of packs. Hopefully when we open the other two, we'll get maybe some elites. But alright, let's head into the cards now. So we got all of the Legion cards, which is quite nice. But let's go to the first nation, Germany. So Germany had a lot of cards that aren't enabling. So I think the biggest thing that Germany got is a big push for their combined arms. There's a lot of cards in here that care about mixing unit types, which I think is a good thing. I personally love the combined arms archetype, and I always feel sad when it just hasn't worked out. So maybe now it has enough tools to work out. We also saw we just found out that there are some quite powerful control tools existing within Germany now. The nerf to the discard package with the Panther A that happened previously has weakened the deck, but now they have a couple just really solid control tools to make use of. And then they also got some more countermeasure stuff and some other aggro tools. So let's start off with the cheapest card, Lost Convoy. So Lost Convoy is 0 credits. It is a 0 credit countermeasure, and when the enemy deploys a unit, give it -2 attack. So Lost Convoy is a bit of a interesting one. It's definitely quite low impact, but that -2 attack is interesting because early on, a lot of units only have 2, maybe 3 attack, and Lost Convoy essentially means that they have either 0 attack or 1 attack, which could be quite impactful. Namely, I'm thinking against like other aggro decks, like the opponent goes to play their 15th Cavalry Regiment, but now it's a 0/1. That's pretty effective of a tempo tool. You get to kill it for free. They can't even put pressure on you unless they somehow buff it. But I think the biggest thing is that it's a free countermeasure that is relatively easy to activate. That might be really impactful for the countermeasure decks, like with 87th Grenadier and whatnot, who is stuff like the 87th Grenadier, benefit from having a free countermeasure in order to easily turn this on. And it's a very easy effect. If the enemy plays a unit, this guy's getting +2/+2, and whatever unit they played is probably going to be quite low on attack. So maybe we see something there. Otherwise, I don't think Lost Convoy has much of a room. It's just so low impact. So I think that it might find a home in countermeasure decks, but beyond that, it's not particularly that good. Next up, the 28 Jaeger Regiment. So this is kind of there's a lot of debate around this card, but I think it is quite solid of a card for just one or two primary reasons. And I think the biggest reason is it is a 1 credit infantry for the Panzer 35T. You don't have to rely on ally nations to provide all of your cheap 1-credit infantry for that unit anymore, as the Jaeger is a pretty decent little 1-drop. The second reason is that this ambush, when it moves into the front line, is potentially quite powerful against other aggro decks, especially if you can buff this guy up even just a little bit. He becomes incredibly annoying to deal with. Like, for example, against Japan aggro, if you can get him up to 3 attack, which isn't hard in many of the decks, the 28 Jaeger practically just kills everything that the enemy has, and they either have to spend an expensive order like Amphibious Assault or something like that on them, or they have to slam multiple units into it, which is quite powerful for a 1-drop. So I think if we see this card, it will be in certain aggro decks, and it'll depend on what we see. Fast Heinz probably doesn't want this, but it depends on any deck that's running the Panzer 35T. I think the Jaeger is a strong consideration for. Then we move on to Propaganda. So Propaganda is a 1-credit order, and then it says choose and discard a countermeasure from hand and deal 3 damage to the enemy HQ. So this allows you to take your countermeasures and convert them into burn, even though you are doing essentially spending 2 cards to do that. This is a really interesting card because we've seen that countermeasure decks lack finishers. They're not really able to kill you, and once they get into the late game, the countermeasures only do so much. So potentially being able to convert them into just cheap ways to deal 3 damage could be quite a powerful effect. We will see how Propaganda plays out, but I think you probably have to build the... It's hard to... This card really does confuse me. Like, it is such a thinking card. Propaganda, I just don't know how you would even try to build that deck. Would you run the other countermeasures, or are you just running like a handful of countermeasures, Propaganda, and then like just a German control deck, and then you just, throw away your low impact, countermeasures such as like Lost Convoy to Propaganda and just burn the enemy to death? It's really interesting, and I don't think it's going to enable any real decks right now. There's probably a little bit too much healing still in the meta, that trying to burn the enemy down in a slower manner might not be effective, but Germany does have Comet, and it does have expensive cards like Kriegsmarine and Bismarck, so maybe there's a burn deck there that I'm not seeing. We'll have to see. Next up is the 104th Panzer Grenadier. It is a 2-credit, 1 operation cost infantry. It is a 3/3, and it has deployment, reduce the operation cost by 1 if you control a tank. This is a big card, especially for combined arms. Essentially, if you play a tank on 1, the 104th Panzer Grenadier is a 3/3 that operates for free. That is very strong for a 2-drop. It's able to fight most other 1 and 2 drops, kill them, and still live. We've seen the 3/3 stat line be very powerful before, although this being an infantry and not having like any like keywords might balance it out. But I think this is definitely a very strong card. Now the question becomes, what deck wants this? As I said before, I think the combined arms deck definitely will run this. They love to play out 1-credit tanks, and this curves so well into it, and it's so big and operating for free that it's able to give you like the ability to continue developing your board while still using units on the board. So I think combined arms like absolutely loves this card. The question becomes, I think, does a tank aggro deck want this? And I think it depends on the list. We've seen a variety of the Fast Heinz decks. For example, a German-Japan Heinz deck using cheap tanks, I actually don't think would want this. They're not playing a lot of 1-credit tanks out, and they also aren't even really playing stuff like the Panzer 35T, because they're just going to use like stuff like the Grief or the for the Emperor to reduce the operation cost. So they'd rather have tanks out rather than the slower infantry. Maybe I'm incorrect there. I'm not the most experienced with that version of the list, but I don't know if they would be willing to find room for this. But it might just be so well statted that you just run it there regardless of how much it synergizes. I think the German US version is going to be a bit more impactful. The 104th is going to, I think, fit a lot better into that list, as that deck is playing a healthy mix of early infantry and also cheap tanks. So I think it is more reasonable that the 104th is fitting into that deck. On top of that, they are not that deck. The US variant of Fast Heinz doesn't really run many ways to reduce operation costs besides Grief. So the 104th being able to operate for free is, I think, a bigger impact there. So I think that's probably the best version of the aggro deck for this card. But I think Combined Arms is definitely like the standout position for this card. This is really good. I expect to see this a lot, to be honest. Next up, the 1097 Volks Grenadier. It is a 2 credit, 1 operation cost infantry. It is a special. It has 2 attack, 3 defense, and has deployment, get +2 defense and guard if the enemy controls a blitz unit. So that means that if the enemy has a blitz unit out, this is a 2/5 guard for 2 credits. That is quite strong. That is just a slightly weaker Issa Rae regiment. Granted, the condition does need to be fulfilled, but against aggro decks, every aggro deck's playing blitz. If you like, it is almost a guarantee you'll be able to activate this, and this is really strong. I think an overwhelming majority of slower German decks are going to be running this. In fact, I could even see some aggro decks running this, simply because in mirror matches, this is such a strong card, I think. 5 health is so much on turn 2, and even on turn 3, it's so much. And, you know, they're going to have to burn removal. Plus, Germany's first guard unit that is, like, actually matters. Like, this is a condition for guard that actually works, which is incredible. The only other card with guard had to be in the front line to have it, so this is Germany's first guard unit, and that's a big thing. I think expect to kind of see this as a staple of most slow German decks. I think it's just really, really good. Next up, the Heinkel HE115. It is a 2 credit, 1 operation cost bomber. It is one of the German elites. It has 1 attack and 3 defense. And it has the text Blitz, and when this unit attacks, add a Spoils of War to your hand. Spoils of War is the 2 credit card that lets you choose one of the top 3 cards of your deck and draw it. So this is essentially a kind of very similar to like the Panzer IIIH, which is that 4 credit, 2/4 tank that lets you look at the top 3. It's very similar to that, but it comes down a lot sooner, and it can potentially produce more versions of that. This card could potentially be very strong, because if it sticks even for 1 turn, you're likely having 2 Spoils of War added to hand, which is, technically 2, which is quite a lot of value for such a little cheap card. I think this can fit into a lot of decks. For cheaper decks, it's essentially 3, if you think about it like the Nebelwerfer, which is a 3 credit 2/2 artillery that deals 1 to a unit on deployment. This is almost the same thing because it costs 3 credits to play and then attack with it. So you get to deal 1 damage to something, which could ping off like an early drop. You get the Spoils of War in hand, and then the enemy has to either try to ignore this bomber, which is hard to do, or spend time killing it. So I think this actually has a lot of like just really good things going for it, and it's going to probably find its way into a large amount of decks. Going back to Combined Arms again, that deck enjoys tutored draws like this. That deck really wants to find, like, it's Combined Arms is kind of like an aggressive deck that also has a combo element to it. So being able to do like Spoils of War in order to dig for certain pieces is really useful. On top of that, it's also a German bomber, so that's also potentially highly impactful. But even beyond that, I think, again, most slow German decks, I think, are probably going to start running this. It's just, I think, a really solid card. And then also, maybe there's some aggressive deck that runs it. Probably not. The Spoils of War are probably a bit too expensive in that regard. But maybe if there's like a backline deck for Germany. So far that hasn't materialized, but if it does, I think the Heinkel fits in there quite well. But yeah, I think mostly for Combined Arms and Control again. Next up, Rite of the Valkyries. This is a 2-credit elite order, and it has the text: the enemy HQ gets, if this HQ has taken 3 or more damage this turn, you gain 2 credits. So, wow. In my opinion, this is really, really strong. There is a bit of an opportunity cost to play it, but once it gets going, oh my god, that is kind of insane. You essentially play a 2-credit, gain 2 credit slots if you can keep attacking the enemy HQ. Which aggro decks can do very easily. We've seen that a card like a Nakshub, which is the 0-4 elite infantry for Germany, that has done a lot for the decks, aggro decks, being able to essentially allow you tons of free credits. And although this is more limited in its scope, still, this is also uncounterable. There's nothing the enemy can do to stop this outside of, I guess, Ultra. So you play this, and then you can just keep attacking face, and, you essentially just get to, like, some free attacks in there with, like, Blitz units, or with, like, I think the fast Heinz decks are really going to want to find room for this. It's a bit slow, again, on the start, but I think, like, Heinz can apply pressure, and then if they can, like, for example, if you can, like, play Rite of the Valkyries out and then, like, Grief and then attack in, you essentially it essentially pays for itself on the same turn. So that's really strong. I think this card is kind of nutty. And I think, like, a lot of aggro decks are going to be stuffing it in here because it's just free credits that the enemy can't do much about unless they can really start blocking the HQ attacks, which isn't the easiest thing against Heinz and whatnot. Next up, the 136 Jaeger. It is a 3-credit, 1 operation cost, 4/3 infantry, and it has the keyword Alpine on it. So this is another Alpine unit. I've talked about this previously, but essentially this is 4 more Alpine units for the German-Italian Alpine deck. That is quite strong. Just having the consistency goes up quite a lot. Before, you could run about 14 Alpine cards in a deck, 12 Italian Alpine and the 2 special Jaeger's from Allegiance. But now you get to run an additional 4. So that puts you up to 18 that you can run in the deck. That's a big consistency boost. That's almost half the deck is Alpine now. This guy, if you buff him up once, is quite good. And anything beyond that, and he starts getting kind of crazy. If Alpine is existence at all, I think this is one of the big reasons why the consistency boost is just so big. From just having, 4 more added to it. Beyond Alpine, obviously, I don't think it has anywhere else to live. It's an Alpine card. But I think within that deck, this is a big, like, mid-game threat, that really keeps the pressure on and just boosts the consistency a lot. Next up, we have the BF 109 E7 Trope, or Trop, whichever one you want to call it. It is a 4-credit, 2 operation cost, 3/3 fighter, and it has the text: deployment +1/+1 if you control a tank, or infantry +3/+3 if you control both. So this is a Combined Arms card, just straight out. If you control a tank and an infantry, this is a 4-credit 6/6 plane. And that is actually not a hard condition to fulfill, especially when you have such infantry like the previous 104th Panzer Grenadier, and Germany has so many cheap tanks, just pick like any of them, They aren't easy to remove, and the trop comes down and just applies so much more pressure, The enemy has to be dealing with whatever board you've built up the last 3 turns, and then you just have a 6/6 plane that they now also have to work against. I think for combined arms, this is really, really strong, and is a big enabler of the deck. It's just that the deck before didn't have that many fighters that it wanted to run. The best was the Focke-Wulf 190, but at 6 credits, that was a bit much. So I think having a cheap but usable fighter is a big buff to the card, or to the deck. It's another unit type that you can now more reliably have, which is a big benefit. Beyond combined arms, I don't see much space for this. Maybe in some mid-range deck, but I don't know. Because mid-range is, if you're going like a mid-range and trying to use this card, it's probably going to just end up as like a combined arms deck. So I think overall, almost solely a combined arms card, but I think a really nice card for that deck. Enemy Sighted is our next card. It is a 5-credit German special order, and it says destroy target unit with cost 3 or less, draw a card. So this is essentially a super big sudden strike. It is kind of expensive for the cost, but it replaces itself, and 3 or less is actually a pretty wide gap. Almost, I can't really think of any deck that doesn't run at least a 3-drop. So this actually, I think, hits, quite a lot, and is another card that is going to fit into a lot of the German control decks. We've seen with previous examples that cards that replace themselves while usually killing an enemy are good, and I think that this is kind of just the same thing. It is expensive, so it is like a mid-game card, but like being able to kill big buffed up units, or just kill practically most cheap drops is just useful. So I think it's reasonable to say that this will be a pretty common card in most slow German decks. And then the next card, the Ju-88 G6. It is a 5-credit, 2 operation cost, 4/6 fighter. It is a special, and it has the text, when this destroys a unit, add a copy of the destroyed unit to your hand. So this is, I don't think, a very strong card. There is like the potential for a very high value ceiling. I think the first thing a lot of people thought of was like, oh my god, we can steal like Leopolds and B-17 bombers and Avengers and all that. And yeah, you can do that, but this card's really slow also. It is actually very similar to the P-47 Thunderbolt, which currently doesn't see any play at all in any US deck. And I would say that the US has an easier time playing like a vanilla statted unit because they're able to ramp up so they can play it out and then do other things on the turn. But Germany doesn't really have that as much. So I think the Ju-88 is mostly a fun card. It is just a little bit too vanilla. Like obviously if they had slapped Blitz on this probably would be pretty insane, but that would probably be a little bit too much. So I think as is, it's going to be a fun meme card. I think we're going to get some fun interactions out of it, like if we see any highlight videos, I think the Ju-88 stealing like several high value targets will be in there. I also think this is going to cause a lot of confusion as people have their cards stolen and don't realize it. So we'll see who this confuses. But otherwise, I don't see much of a place for it. And then the final card is Gathering Storm. 8 credit. It is an 8 credit order, and it draws a random infantry, tank, artillery, and fighter from your deck. So this is kind of comparable to Lend Lease. You pay 1 extra credit, but you do get to tutor. You do get all of your cards to tutor. Having played Combined Arms quite a lot, I think Gathering Storm naturally fits in there quite easily. You very often have, like, even going into turn 8, it is very easy to often have one of each of the unit types within your deck without needing to... it was a very powerful... Gathering Storm is a strong draw option. Lend-Lease is less consistent, and because of how I talked about Combined Arms as a sort of combo deck, this is almost like drawing your combo to an extent. I tried Lend-Lease a lot in the Combined Arms deck, and it just wasn't very good. It's expensive, and you can't guarantee you're drawing impactful stuff, but with Gathering Storm, you are probably going to be drawing more impactful stuff. Like, for example, you know, I don't think it's unrealistic that you run the BF 109 E7 trope alongside the elite Yag Bomber. That means you're always getting, you know, like a 6/6 or the 5/4 that bounces the enemy on turn 8, you know, to refill, which I think gives Gathering Storm an edge. Being able to tutor up your, you know, pieces to power up a Combined Arms play, or, you know, just overall, you know, I think there's a lot of synergy with this card and stuff like the trope and most other Combined Arms style cards. So I think it is going to be pretty strong of a card in Combined Arms. I'm not saying that Combined Arms is going to be a strong deck, but I think that this is definitely a good card to include at least 1 or 2 copies in, because it does give you that extra, that last turn burst, or not burst, but a late game refill that the deck can sometimes be lacking. And that is all the German cards. Overall, my thoughts are, I think Germany got a handful of very interesting cards. We saw a lot of underdeveloped archetypes, I think, get some nice support. The countermeasure decks with Lost Convoy and Propaganda, we'll have to see how that works out, but there could be something there, maybe. I don't think so, but I think there's also potentially a lot of power. We also saw Alpine get buffed, Combined Arms get buffed. We have some aggro cards, some control cards. And overall, I think that we just have a lot of good stuff. So I want to thank everybody out so much for watching. Make sure to just subscribe and like and comment. And we'll be back for the British cards next.